Stop believing that Alexander the Great built an empire that simply fell apart after his death. Here is what the evidence actually shows. And it is far stranger, far darker, and far more deliberate than any textbook ever told you. In 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon at 32 years old. Within 50 years, the single largest empire the ancient world had ever witnessed, stretching 3,000 miles from Greece to the edge of India, did not slowly crumble. It was systematically dismembered, province by province, by the very men who swore loyalty to it. But here is the question nobody asks. How does an empire that controls 2 million square miles of territory, commands hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and holds more gold than any state in history simply vanish? Not decline, not fracture slowly over centuries. Vanish. Stay with me because the answer will change the way you think about power itself. Here is the story most people carry around in their heads. Alexander was a lone genius, a singular force of nature. He conquered everything, and when he died, the empire died with him because no single man could hold something that vast together. It is a clean, satisfying narrative. The great man rises, the great man falls. The empire collapses because empires always do. You have probably heard some version of this your whole life. It shows up in documentaries, in school textbooks, in Hollywood films. The myth is almost romantic in its simplicity. Alexander was the glue, and without him, everything dissolved naturally, inevitably, almost peacefully, and the empire became a footnote, a monument to one man's ego rather than a functioning civilization. That is the myth. It is tidy, it is emotionally satisfying, and it is almost entirely wrong. The myth survives because it contains just enough truth to feel credible. Alexander really was exceptional. He really did die young with no clear succession plan. His only legitimate heir, Alexander IV, was an infant. His other heir, Philip III Aridaeus, had severe cognitive disabilities and could not rule effectively. So on the surface, the leadership vacuum is real. Ancient historians like Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch emphasized Alexander's personal genius so heavily that later readers absorbed the idea that the empire was always a one-man operation. There is also a psychological reason you believe it. Human beings are wired to explain systemic collapse through individual failure. It is easier to point at one man's death than to map the complex web of betrayal, economic warfare, and coordinated political assassination that actually destroyed the Macedonian Empire. The lone genius narrative gives the story a beginning, a middle, and an end. Reality is messier than that. Reality almost always is. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. If the empire simply collapsed due to a leadership vacuum, you would expect a slow, grinding decline, rebellions at the periphery, economic contraction, gradual loss of territory over decades. That is how empires normally die. Rome took 200 years to fall apart in the West. The Ottoman Empire spent over a century contracting, but Alexander's empire did not follow that pattern at all. Within just 22 years of his death, by 301 BC, the empire had been carved into 5 distinct successor kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Persia, Antigonus's domain in Anatolia, Cassander's Macedonia, and Lysimachus's Thrace. These were not the messy remnants of collapse. These were organized, functional, wealthy states with defined borders, standing armies, and royal courts. Someone built those. Someone planned those borders. Someone deliberately killed every remaining member of Alexander's bloodline to make sure none of them could reunite what had been divided. That is not collapse. That is a coup conducted in slow motion. The historical record of the Wars of the Diadochi, the successor wars, runs from 322 BC to 281 BC. 40 years of continuous, calculated conflict between Alexander's own generals. His name for these men, the Diadochi, meaning the successors. And what they did was not mourn the empire, they cannibalized it. Perdiccas, Alexander's regent, was assassinated by his own officers in 320 BC during a failed campaign in Egypt. Antipater seized control of Macedonia and poisoned the political well against every claimant to central authority. Eumenes of Cardia, the one general who genuinely tried to preserve the empire for Alexander's bloodline, was hunted down and executed in 316 BC after being betrayed by his own mercenaries, who were bribed by Antigonus. Alexander's mother, Olympias, who fought ferociously to protect her grandson Alexander IV, was captured and executed in 316 BC. And then in 309 BC, Alexander IV himself, the legitimate heir, then just 14 years old, was quietly poisoned on the orders of Cassander. The empire did not disappear. It was murdered, methodically, by insiders who understood exactly what they were destroying and chose to destroy it anyway. So why did Alexander's generals do it? Why destroy something so powerful that it could have made all of them wealthy and secure for generations? The answer comes down to a psychology that historians call imperial fragmentation incentive, and it is terrifying in its logic. Controlling 1/5 of a vast empire makes you a king. Serving as a general in a unified empire makes you an employee. Every single one of Alexander's senior commanders, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, calculated that a divided empire was more valuable to them personally than a unified one was collectively. Ptolemy, I said it explicitly. When asked why he had not marched to support the empire's unity, he reportedly told his advisors, "A kingdom seized is more secure than a kingdom inherited." These men were not victims of collapse. They were architects of it. And the reason you have never heard it framed this way is because the winners wrote the history. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for 275 years. The Seleucids ruled Persia for over 2 centuries. They had every reason to frame their kingdoms as legitimate successors rather than what they actually were, the spoils of a coordinated imperial assassination. Here is why this matters beyond ancient history. The collapse of Alexander's empire is not a story about one man dying too young. It is a masterclass in how institutions fail, not from external pressure but from internal incentive misalignment. The people with the most power and the most to gain from protecting the system were the same people who had the most to gain from breaking it. You see this pattern everywhere once you know what to look for. You see it in corporations where senior executives liquidate stock options while publicly projecting confidence. You see it in political systems where the people appointed to strengthen institutions quietly hollow them out. The ancient world understood something we keep relearning. The greatest threat to any empire is never the enemy at the gates. It is always the general standing right behind the throne. If you want to go deeper on exactly this psychology, why powerful civilizations collapse from within, I cannot recommend enough the audiobook The Fall of Civilizations by Paul Cooper, available on Audible. Cooper explores 12 collapsed civilizations with the same forensic depth we have just applied here, and the patterns he finds are genuinely unsettling in the best possible way. It is the kind of book that makes you see the present differently. Link is in the description. Here is your action step for today. The next time you read about a civilization that fell or an institution that collapsed, ask yourself one question before you accept the official explanation. Who benefited from the collapse? In 90% of cases, you will find that the people positioned as mourners were actually the architects. Alexander's empire did not disappear. It was divided deliberately by men who understood that controlled demolition is more profitable than preservation. That insight is 2,300 years old, and it has never stopped being true. If this changed how you think about imperial history, share this video with one person who still believes the textbook version. The comments are open. I want to know, which of Alexander's successors do you think made the most ruthless, calculated move? Drop your answer below, and subscribe if you want more history that does not let the winners tell the whole story. Before you go, a quick note on sources. The primary ancient sources for this video include Diodorus Siculus' Bibliotheca Historica, Plutarch's Lives, and Arrian's Anabasis Alexandri. Modern scholarship from historian Peter Green's Alexander to Actium was also foundational to the framing here. History is interpretation, and these events happened over 2 millennia ago. So reasonable historians do disagree on motivations and timelines. What is not disputed is the sequence of events. Every member of Alexander's bloodline was dead within a generation, and every general who killed them died a king. Draw your own conclusions from that. Disclaimer. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing constitutes professional advice of any kind.